Hey, well, welcome everyone. Good morning. Today we are having our first event in the Exploring Social Justice series. This event today will be with Dr. Gamble, who I will introduce shortly. She will be presenting on her work, and the presentation is titled A Practice in Protest, the Work of Early Black Women Physicians. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the Exploring Social Justice series. This series is a program started in 2014 by the American University Library, and it is co-sponsored by the Center for Diversity and Inclusion and the K Spiritual Life Center. The series brings to campus exemplary leaders from diverse backgrounds who are advocates for a range of human rights and social justice issues. The full list of speakers is on the library's events page with registration links. There will be one speaker per week through the week of November 7th. Today's event kicks off the 2020-2021 program. So during the talk, please submit questions for the speaker using chat. Submitted questions will be addressed at the conclusion of the presentation, and I will be moderating those questions. Your mics have been muted for the program, and if there are any additional Q&A at the very end of the presentation, you may be unmuted then. So again, welcome. My name is Dr. Jessica Owens-Young. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Health Studies at American University. And I'm so excited to introduce a scholar whose work has really influenced me since my days in grad school. So, Dr. Vanessa Northington Gamble is University Professor of Medical Humanities, Professor of Health Policy, and Professor of Medicine at the George Washington University. A physician, scholar, and activist, she is an internationally recognized expert on the history of race in American medicine, racial inequities in health and health care, and bioethics. She is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and a fellow of the Hastings Center. A proud native of West Philadelphia, Dr. Gamble received her BA from Hampshire College and her MD and PhD in the history and sociology of science from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Gamble?
Thank you, Dr. Owens-Young, for that nice introduction. One of the things I'm actually surprised you did not say is that I used to work at Hopkins where you got your degree. So we can talk about that later. And I'm really happy to be here today, and especially under an event that's sponsored by the library. I, from junior high school to the end of college, worked in libraries and even went through a training program to become a reference librarian. And I think that is like the biggest skill that I have taken from my years as an undergraduate. And I'm really happy, as I said, to be here to kick off this series on exploring social justice. So let's get started here. This here is Mary Bassett. Mary Bassett used to be the head of the New York City Department of Public Health. Now she's at Harvard, where she runs the Center for Human Rights and Public Health. And in this article, hashtag Black Lives Matter, she puts a challenge to the medical and public health communities. And in this essay, she, I think, powerfully and eloquently wrote of, and I quote, her strong moral and professional obligations of physicians to encourage critical dialogue and action on issues of racism and health, and urged health professionals, let's not sit on the sidelines. See, she also wrote, I would like to believe that there are at least 3 types of action through which we can make a difference: critical research, internal reform, and public advocacy. In reflecting on these possibilities, I add, she said, to nearly 2 centuries of calls for critical thinking and action advanced by Black US physicians and their allies. And as I read this essay, I found that these words particularly compelling because Dr. Bassett's words precisely describe the work of many of the early Black women physicians. However, the work, lives, and contributions of these pioneers in social justice are frequently unrecognized, even today. At a time when there is more interest in anti-racism activism in medicine and public health, these physicians used their medical degrees to establish hospitals, found civic organizations, provide medical care to communities neglected by white physicians, and gain prominence as social activists and thought leaders. So what my goal is today is to examine the unexplored history of early Black women physicians in campaigns for social justice and health equity. Because this is an area that when we talk about social justice, Black women physicians are often left out of the conversation. Now, I want to start here. Can a colored woman be a physician? This is the title of an article that Dr. E.B. Du Bois wrote in the 1930s. And the reason I want to start here is that one of the things that Black women physicians have had to do in the past and have to do today is challenge stereotypical notions of Black women and their worth and work. And so even today, people are surprised that Black women can be physicians. So let's look at the words of Dr. Dorothy Fairby. Dr. Dorothy Fairby graduated from Tufts Medical School in 1924. And she spent most of her career in Washington, D.C. at Howard University Medical School. And when she was talking about her years at Tufts, she said, it was not easy. The medical school had 5 women out of 137 students. We women were always the last to get assignments in amphitheaters and clinics. And I was the last of the last, because not only was I a woman, but a Negro too. So this comment from Dr. Fairby highlights, I think, that Black women had to face racism and sexism. Here's May Chen. May Chen graduated from New York University Medical School. She was its first Black graduate. She also was the first woman intern at Harlem Hospital. And when she talked about her Black colleagues, the first group didn't believe that a woman should be a doctor, so they pretended that I didn't exist. The second group actively discouraged patients from coming to me. What can she do that a man cannot do better? The third group said they were helping me by sending me on their night calls after midnight. The other thing that Dr. Chen in her oral history has talked about, she's talked about how when she walked into a patient's room once, a patient burst into tears because she felt, and this was a Black patient, she felt as if she had been denied the privilege of being cared for by a white physician. So this is this article that I was talking about that Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in 1933. And he raised the question, can a colored woman be a physician? And the focus of this article is Dr. Virginia Alexander, who I'm going to talk about later. And he said in Dr. Alexander's case that she was qualified to be a physician. But even asking that question, can a colored woman be a physician? I myself, when I was in medical school, I walked into a patient's room, I examined the patient, and when I walked out, he said to the white intern, why didn't that girl clean up while she was in here? He thought I was the maid. And I thought, if I had been a white woman, that at least, he would have thought that I was a nurse. And so this whole thing about Black woman equals maid. Now that was many years ago. I don't want to say how many years ago when I was in medical school, but it continues. Some of you might have heard of what happened in 2016 when a Black female physician was on a Delta flight and there was a patient who had a medical issue. She went up and the flight attendant said, we're looking for actual physicians. So this belief that Black women cannot be physicians. And I think that is a part of the social activism of Black women, dispelling these stereotypes. And earlier, a few months ago, there was an article in the New York Times talking about Black women physicians, and that they are still considered, Black women are still considered not physicians. And their one quote was, they ask you if you're coming to take out the trash, stuff they wouldn't ask a physician who was a white male. So what I'd like to do is just talk about the history of Black women physicians. Who were these women who went on to become physicians? This here is Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, and she was the third Black woman physician in the United States. She came from Brooklyn. And in 1914, she talked about sisters of a darker race who have taken advantage of stepping into the doors of medical opportunity. In 1914, she estimated that there were 35 sisters of a darker race who had become physicians. They were all around the country. In 1920, according to the census, there were 100, according to the census in 1920, there were 65 Black women physicians. In 1923, Sarah Winifred Brown, who was a 1904 graduate of Howard University College of Medicine, wrote an article about Black women physicians. And she talks about colored women physicians continue to force themselves to the front throughout the United States. And in this article, she talked about Black women across the country and their work and the contributions that they made to the Black community. Dr. Brown estimated that there were about 94 Black women physicians, some of which had been deceased, and 68% of them either went to Howard University or Meharry Medical School, which were two of the Black medical schools that were in existence in 1923. But the school that had the largest number of Black women, that was a predominantly white school, was Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. And some of my work, I'm very interested in these Black women who went to Women's Medical College because they were Black women in white spaces. And so I'm going to talk about this later, but let me first talk about the first Black woman physician. This here is New England Female Medical College. It was located in Boston. It is now part of Boston University. And in 1864, the first Black woman received her medical degree. So let me repeat that, 1864, before the end of the Civil War, there was a Black woman who had gotten a medical degree. Her name was Rebecca Lee, and later Crumpler. She was from, she grew up in Delaware, then went to Boston, where she worked as a nurse. And one of her physicians said that with whom she worked, said that she should go to medical school. She went to medical school in Boston, and as I said, she was the first Black woman to graduate. And when she graduated, she got a doctorate, which was a degree that the school gave, but also it was noted that she was a negress. So the fact that she was a doctoress, a woman, and a negress, meaning a Black woman, that is an identification that has followed Black women since Rebecca Lee graduated. Now, I don't have a picture of Rebecca Lee. There's none has been found, but what I do have, and what you see here, is a book that she wrote. And she wrote this book in 1883. And it was a book where she talks about how women especially should take care of their children. And so I don't have a picture. And this is, you see some of the things, that were in the book, how to marry, the milk fever, time for weaning. So this is the first book written by a Black physician. Earlier this year, a few months ago, there was a ceremony in Boston to put a tombstone on Dr. Crumpler's grave. Up until this point, there was not a tombstone for her. The second Black woman was a woman by the name of Rebecca Cole. There's also not a photograph of hers, but I'm determined to get photographs of both of these women. Rebecca Cole got her degree in 1867, so 3 years after Rebecca Crumpler. She was from Philadelphia, went to Women's Medical College. And the reason, you'll see that in this presentation, I'm going to be using a lot of photographs because I think it's important to see the images of these women. And this is Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, who I talked about earlier. This is a later picture of her. She helped to start a hospital in Brooklyn, and I feel a real affiliation to Susan Smith McKinney Stewart because when I was in medical school, I wrote the Susan Smith McKinney Medical Society, which was the first Black women's medical society, and asked, and someone told me that they gave scholarships to students. It turned out they did not give scholarships to students, but when they got my letter, they decided that they should give scholarships to women. And so, and the money came, as they say, on time. So as I said, I have an affinity for this group. So who were these women? What were their background? Many of these women come from what's called, historians call the representative families. And what I mean by representative families is that they came from socially prominent families who urged their daughters to become educated to avoid being trapped in a life of menial labor or domestic service. On the left is Carolyn Still Wiley Anderson. She is from Philadelphia. A lot of these women are from Philadelphia. And I think that's my bias since I too am from Philadelphia, but many of the first Black women did come from Philadelphia. Dr. Carolyn Still Wiley Anderson, and I point out several of these women married more than once, and so that's why there's the long names here. And she was a member of a prosperous and prominent abolitionist family. Her father, William Still, was very active in the Underground Railroad. He and his wife ran one of the most active stations on the Underground Railroad. If you've seen the film Harriet, Leslie Odoms, who has the part in the film, he has the part in his hair, played William Still in the film Harriet. But he also was frequently called the father of the Underground Railroad. But not only was he active politically, he also was wealthy. He was a wealthy coal merchant, and he always encouraged his oldest daughters of professional aspirations. Hallie Tanner Dillon Johnson, her father was a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and he also was a journal editor. This is Dorothy Fairby, who I talked about earlier. Dorothy Fairby was born in Norfolk, Virginia, but as a child, she was sent to live with relatives in Boston, including her great aunt, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, and her great uncle, George Louis Ruffin. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was the founder of National Association of Colored Women, and her husband was the first Black graduate of Harvard Law School. This here is a picture of Alice Hathaway Purvis Roby. Her father was a physician in Washington. He also was at Howard University School of Medicine, one of the first Black faculty members in the United States. He also was a founder of the Interracial National Medical Society of the District of Columbia that had been established because the standing medical organization did not allow Black patients. And this is Daisy Brown Bonner. And that's, her in the back. Here's another picture of Daisy Brown Bonner. She's from Mississippi. Her father was also a physician, and around 1910, he may have been the wealthiest African American in Mississippi. So much so that when he ordered a car, he was going to have the first car in Greenville, Mississippi. But the white citizens would not allow the car to be unloaded from the train because they did not want to have this black man have a car when no other people in the town could have a car. Her father was very wealthy. He owned oil wells in Oklahoma and even named a town after her in Oklahoma. So these women were, they were elite. Their families were wealthy, but not all of the first Black women physicians were wealthy. Indeed, they came from hard scrabble backgrounds. I talked about Rebecca Cole. Rebecca Cole's father was a janitor and her mother was a laundress. This here is Virginia Alexander, who is from Philadelphia, but she also came from a disadvantaged background. Both her parents had been born enslaved in Virginia. They came from Virginia to Philadelphia. They migrated to the ward in Philadelphia. Some of you might have heard of Ward 7, which W.E.B. Du Bois analyzed in his book, The Philadelphia Negro. When she was 5, her mother died. And her father lost his business. And so she had, all throughout her life, she had to work in order to support the family. And this is a picture of her parents, Hilliard Alexander and Virginia Pace Alexander. Now, some of these first Black women physicians themselves were born enslaved. I said that Virginia Alexander's father and mother had been born enslaved, but Lulu Fleming herself was born enslaved in Florida. And her father, when she was an infant, her father tried to escape. The family was captured. He was never seen again by the family. There are some reports that he did go to a fight with the United States colored troops. Another person who was born enslaved was Dr. Eliza Anna Greer. She was born enslaved as an infant. So the point here is that these women came from different backgrounds. So I said that one of the things I'm interested in is, in terms of the activism and focusing on the social justice work of these women, is their educations in white medical spaces. And sociologist Elijah Anderson talks about the white space as a place where you usually don't see Black people. And when you see Black people there, they're usually marginalized, disrespected, or ignored. So I want to talk about the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. And the reason I want to do this is that you see the beginnings of some of the activism of Black women physicians while they were in medical school. This here is a picture of the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. It was started in 1850. And between 1850 and 1925, it graduated 18 Black women physicians. And as I said in my opening remarks, it educated more Black women than any other medical school other than Howard and Meharry. This here is Sarah Mapps Douglas. Sarah Mapps Douglas in 1852, 2 years after the medical school opened, entered the medical school. She is from a prominent Black family in Philadelphia. Her family also were abolitionists, but she entered medical school, and as I said, in 1852, but she did not graduate. She did not graduate from medical school because becoming a physician was not what she wanted to do. She had a long career as an educator, and wanted to go to medical school to learn hygiene and physiology to be able to teach it to Black women. But as I said, Rebecca Cole was the first Black woman to graduate from Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. Now, one of the things that I've been trying to find more information about, and it's slowly coming, is how were these women treated once they got into medical school? In this case, Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. There's some indication that some of the women, the 18 women who graduated up until 1925, some of them said that they did not have any problems. In fact, an 1886 article in a newspaper says that the women were always treated with cordiality. But my work has shown that they were not always treated with cordiality. Rebecca Cole, when she was a senior, she had to do a clerkship at a hospital in Philadelphia and had to stay overnight at the hospital, but no one wanted to share a room with her. So her career was jeopardized because she was almost not able to get a medical degree because she did not get the clerkship. They find that the school finally did get someone to room with her. This here is Pauline Dinkins. Pauline Dinkins' father was a president of a Baptist university in Selma, Alabama, and she left some letters and where she discussed being at a women's medical college. And what she did in terms of being this letter, she graduated in 1919 and then wrote a letter to the dean after she got, her credentials in order to graduate, and said to the dean, "I want to tell you why I did not stay for the tea after graduation." And she said that in this letter, it's a very frank and poignant letter. And she talks about her loneliness, her isolation, and her disregard. She wrote, "I was never able to feel like a real member of the class, nor even like a part of the school. Every bit of my energy was taken in forcing myself to stay to the end." And her disillusionment began, she says, shortly after she arrived at medical school, when a professor used the phrase "because of her race." And the dean responded telling her that she was being overly sensitive and that she could not take the burdens of African Americans on her shoulders. But the experiences of Virginia Alexander, who was at Women's Medical College from 1920 to 1925, I think illuminates some of the challenges that African American women faced in medicine, but it also shows their resilience and also their activism. She went to medical school, as I said, starting in 1920. She was the only Black woman in her class. She was an active member of the class. She was on the basketball team. Playing basketball was very popular at some of the women's medical schools. She played basketball. There was going to be a dance for the members of the basketball team, and she was not allowed to go because they feared that Black men would come with her. And so the dance was canceled. The other thing that happened during her first year at medical school is that her classmates held a minstrel show. They held a minstrel show in order to raise funds for a Far East charity. And the fact that this minstrel show was announced in the school, it was in the school bulletin, shows, I think, that how it was accepted, certain racism was accepted. One of her classmates showed up as the Gold Dust Twins. The Gold Dust Twins were advertisements for a washing detergent. The next year, Virginia Alexander gained some Black colleagues, and she felt a lot better. But the discrimination did not stop. There was a teacher who lectured the students, the Black students, telling them that no matter what you did, you would always be a Negro, that you would never go over your people. Also, when there were Black students in his class, he would tell, as they put it, he would just talk about Black people in a very disrespectful term. So the students protested. Virginia Alexander wrote, and 3 other Black students wrote a letter to the dean of the medical school protesting the situation. And she said, the letter read, "When the situation became intolerable, our self-respect demanded that we register protest." So even as medical students, you see that some of these Black women were fighting for social justice. And one of the ways that, that they had to fight for social justice was to fight for their place in medicine, because in the 1920s, internships became critical to the careers of physicians. So that where white women were accepted for internships, Black women and Black men were not accepted. And where Black men were accepted, Black women were barred. And so one of the things that happened with Black women, they had to fight to get internships. And one such woman was Isabella Vanderwaal. Isabella Vanderwaal graduated as valedictorian of her medical school, New York Medical College for Women in New York. She was from Newark. Her father was a wealthy businessman. And as I said, she graduated first in her class. And even though she was first in her class, she could not get an internship because she was Black. And so she goes to hospitals in New York. They saw her and they said, "Sorry, we can't let you here, you're Black." There was one hospital that said, "Well, we'll let you try out. And if the patients don't complain, we will let you continue." And she did. She performed well, no patients complained. And then the hospital superintendent said, "Oh, we did that as a joke." She finally got an internship in Syracuse. And she packed her bags, enough bags for a year, because an internship was a year. She was not going to be coming back to New Jersey. And she got to Syracuse, and the superintendent saw her and said, "We can't have you. You are Black." And she stayed in Syracuse to fight for an internship. And they kept saying, "No, you are Black." But one of the things that she did, she wrote an article in 1917 talking about some problems of the colored woman physician. And in this, she talks about the state of the problem for Black women getting internships. She was okay because at the time, when internships became critical in order to get a medical license, she had already gotten a medical license, but she was thinking about the Black women who came behind her. And she wanted white women to work with her to try to make sure that Black women were not disregarded in the medical profession. But what this article does not say is that when it was published, she had sued the hospital. She not only sued the hospital, she won. And she won on breach of contract. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People said that her lawsuit was one of the most critical ones for the year in which it was filed. So the hospital settled with her. But her activism came from when she was a girl. Her father, as I said, was wealthy. And when she was in high school, there's going to be a dance. She and her sister were told they could not come. And she said that if there's a dance, we are going to be there. And so what they did, the students said there was not going to be a dance. They canceled the dance and had it at a private organization so that she and her sister could not go. This event, this episode was known nationally. So you see here, this is from the New York Times. So that Isabella Vanderwaal, her work in social justice began when she was a high school student. This here is Lillian Atkins Moore Clark. Her father was a physician in Virginia. And she too could not get an internship at Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. So the hospital at Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania did not allow Black women into its hospital because they thought that Black women, the careers of Black women should be away from that of white women. So when Virginia Alexander applied for her internship, she and her friend Ernest May McCarroll were also not allowed to go into an internship at Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. The hospital said, we will do everything we can to get you an internship, but it had to be at one of the Black hospitals so that their careers would be very separate. And so they went to Kansas City General Hospital #2, also known as Kansas City Colored Hospital. This hospital was a mecca for the training of Black physicians, but they had never had a Black woman. And so the superintendent had to be talked into having Black women come to the hospital. And May McCarroll and Virginia Alexander became the first Black women at a Black hospital, which also I think illustrates the sexism that Black women face. And this is a picture from a newspaper front page talking about May McCarroll and Virginia Alexander being pioneers. So what about their medical practices and careers? Because you start to see some more of the activism of these women. And historian Darlene Clark Hine talks about how much of the work of Black women would facilitate Black survival by keeping Black babies and their mothers alive and healthy. This is another picture of Dr. Hallie Tanner Johnson. After she graduated in 1891 from Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, she went to Tuskegee. Booker T. Washington had taken lots of interest in her career, and she went on to become the first Black, the first woman to be issued a license by the Alabama State Board of Medicine. And while she was at Tuskegee, she established a dispensary. And in this dispensary, she worked to improve the health status of African Americans in Macon County, Alabama, where Tuskegee is located. And what she wrote is, talking about being on the South Black Belt, she found a place that was ravaged by disease, despair, and destitution. And she said, it was Black it is, not only with the people of this despised hue, but Black with death and disease. And so she created a hospital, an outpatient hospital, to help improve the health status of Black people. This is Alice Woodby McCain. She was from Pennsylvania, not Philadelphia, but she was from Pennsylvania. And she and her husband established a hospital in Savannah, Georgia. And one of the things about this school, this hospital, is that there's also a nurse training school for women, that she wanted to have Black women to get jobs as nurses. Many of the women who came to this hospital worked as maids. And Alice McCain had worked as a maid to support herself through medical school. Lucy Hughes Brown was another Black woman who established a hospital and nurse training school to train Black women. This was in Charleston, South Carolina. There's a close-up picture of her. And this is a picture of the hospital that was established in 1897 in Charleston. And this is the first graduating class of the nurses. But one of the most famous Black women physicians was Matilda Evans. Matilda Evans practiced in Columbia, South Carolina. She was the first woman in the town. One newspaper said when she arrived that a woman doctor in Columbia would have been somewhat of a novelty, but that a colored one was an unexpected innovation in the medical profession. But not only did Matilda Evans practice medicine, she was very politically active and worked to get funds to provide clinics and hospitals for African Americans in Columbia. She was a surgeon, and this is, she created 3 hospitals. This is Matilda Evans practicing surgery at the first hospital. And that's the second hospital that she established. And this is the home that she lived in Columbia, which is now a historic site. But she also used the funds that she got from white physicians and also white women to establish clinics to take care of Black women. And their work was not only, it was critical. The work that Matilda Evans and Lucy Brown did, this work was critical for the survival of African Americans. Iona Rowland Whipper, she's a 1903 graduate of Howard. She established in 1931, established a hospital for Black, actually it wasn't a hospital, it was a home for unwed mothers in Washington, D.C., over by Howard. It is still in existence, but it's now the Iona Whipper Home. It gives, it provides care and services for homeless women. This is Virginia Alexander, who I had talked about earlier. Virginia Alexander established a hospital in Philadelphia. This is out of her home, and this is the Esperanto Health Home. That's the inside of the hospital. Now let's talk about some of their social justice activism. Historian Stephanie Shaw talks about how Black professional women, including physicians, work to repair and prevent the damage that frequently resulted from systematic discrimination, and thus their work reflected, and it was not defined by the neglect of existing public institutions. I talked about Rebecca Cole. Rebecca Cole, after medical school, worked in New York, Philadelphia, and also in the district. And but the other thing that she did, she wrote about how the poor health status of African Americans was caused not by biological factors, which was widely believed in the 19th and early 20th century, but by social factors. She talks about heartless landlords who crowded Black people in horrible conditions. She also talked about the need for a political action. But there were other Black women, and she was also in the. This is an article that Rebecca Cole wrote about the first meeting of the Women's Missionary Society of Philadelphia, where not only does she talk about the impact of social factors on the health of Black people, she also talked about the problems of policing in the Black community. And this was in 1896. Carolyn Still Wiley Anderson, she and her husband opened up a vocational school in Philadelphia so that African Americans could get vocational education at a time when they could not be admitted into other places. And that's a picture of the place she started with her husband. Now, I mentioned Alice Woodby McCain earlier. When after her husband died, she moved to Boston, where she became active in politics. She was a Republican when the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. And but she also was an activist where she worked to stop the showing of the racist birth of a nation. And she gathered together a group of Black women. And when she said, she says, shall we fight for existence, or shall we not exist because we are Black? I say fight to the bitter end. Fight until the last drop of blood is gone. We are not fighting as Black people, but as American citizens. Verena Harris Morton Jones was in New York, and she was a suffragette. She also helped to establish a home for a settlement house for Black children, and also one of the first Black medical societies in New York. Melissa Coppin, she started a home in Philadelphia to help Black children. So these women in their practices were really rooted in social activism and also social reform. And two other people I want to end with talking here, of Dorothy Fairby and Virginia Alexander. Dorothy Fairby is on the right, and Virginia Alexander is there on the left. And what they, in 1940, they got an award for outstanding service to Negro health. And in this citation, it focused on how they combined medicine and social activism and work on racial and social justice. Virginia Alexander, after she left Kansas City and opened her practice in Philadelphia, she worked in Philadelphia to desegregate hospitals. Virginia Alexander was a Quaker, and for many years, she was the only Black Quaker in Philadelphia. And she worked with the Race Relations Committee of Philadelphia to open up hospitals to Black patients and also to Black healthcare workers. And in some respects, it was small steps but that she was successful in getting at least the Philadelphia General Hospital, which was the city hospital, to open up for Black physicians. And she wrote an article called Negro Hospitalization in 1937, which came out of work she had done earlier in 1935. And this is, unfortunately, you can't hardly see it because it's a typescript, and it's the social, economic, and health problems of North Philadelphia Negroes and their relation to a proposed interracial public health demonstrations center. She worked with the Quakers in this research project, and I see this work as an example of research-based activism. And with this research-based activism, what she did the research, but she also showed, she used that research to make changes. She looked at health status of African Americans, where she showed that the infant mortality rate in 1926 was twice that of the white infant mortality rate, something we're still dealing with today. The other thing that she did, she talked to patients about their experiences, where women would say they would not want to go to a particular hospital because if they went to their hospital, they found out they could not have babies. But she used this to promote social activism. And she also had a close relationship, an intimate relationship with Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. And because of her work with Du Bois, she too became an advocate of looking at the social factors in causing the poor health status of African Americans. She later went to Yale, where she became the first Black woman to get a degree in public health. And a lot of her work reflected Du Bois's work in The Health and Physique of the Negro American, where he basically focuses on, you not only do you have to do the research, you also have to combine this research with activism. Dorothy Fairby, and Dorothy Fairby for many years was head of the AKA Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. For those of you who are Deltas in the audience, Virginia Alexander was a Delta. And for 7 years, from 1935 to 1942, Dorothy Fairby led an AKA project that went to the Mississippi Delta to provide health care. And they had, because many of the workers could not get around to a clinic, and also because their employers did not want these outside agitators working without strict supervision, they had to take the cars and establish mobile clinics. And there's Dorothy Fairby, giving, taking care of a child. There they are. This is in 1938 with the county health official. And the thing is that by 1940, these were all volunteers. They were not being paid. By 1940, they had immunized over 14,000 children against diphtheria and smallpox, had treated thousands of adults, and had provided venereal disease screening. But Dorothy Fairby did not just want to provide healthcare. She thought that was important. But the other thing is that she also understood the importance of political action. Not only was she later become head of AKA, she also later became head of the National Council for Negro Women. And she testified in Congress about the needs to change the healthcare of African Americans in the Delta. But sometimes, one of the problems when you have a car and you driving through back roads in Mississippi, the car gets stuck. Something tells me that Dorothy Fairby was not one of those pushing the car, but taking the picture. So I just want to end here with a description of Dr. Margaret Lawrence, who died last year at 105. She was one of the first Black psychoanalysts, and her daughter wrote about her that her life had been one of courageous boundary crossing. And enduring the visibility and distortion of tokenism and the double oppressions and assaults of racism and sexism. That was true of many of the early Black women physicians, but they continued on. They made remarkable contributions to the life of Black people in this country, but in so doing, they made it clear that being a physician was Black women's work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I learned so much from these images and all the women that you talked about. This was fascinating. So we have time for a couple of questions. If you have a question, please use the chat feature. But I'll start off with a question of my own.
Okay.
So how do you see, I see these women as like setting the foundations for modern advocacy, right? How do you see the work that these women have done like playing out in more contemporary advocacy efforts for Black health?
Well, I think you're right that they did set the foundation for many of the advocacy, and that's why I think it's important to know about them. I think they set it in a couple of ways. One is that they worked with many different groups, in large part because there'd be one Black physician, one Black nurse, one Black social worker, and so they all work together. So you see that, so the importance of working across one's discipline. The other way I think I see it is that seeing a lot of the work that they did in medicine as political work. So that, and also that, and that they didn't see that as being, exclusive, that was an important part of it. The other way that I see they're doing the foundations is that, they took different routes. So Virginia Alexander did the more research-based activism. Dorothy Fairby worked with, with the more traditional groups. She worked with, Black women's groups. One of the things that Virginia Alexander did, she worked with white allies. She worked with the Quakers. And for her, it was important to do that because she felt that the health status of African Americans would not be successful without getting white Americans also involved. And then the other thing they did, they called the racism, I mean, that letter from Virginia Alexander and the 3 other students in 1924 calling out a member of the faculty. I just thought, every time I read that letter, I just think it's, it's like, it shows, how courageous and fearless they were.
I agree. And I especially see the rise of community-based participatory research as stemming from this foundational work.
Right. I mean, and the other thing too is that, sometimes when you look back, there's things that you don't want to do. Like Dorothy Fairby did great work in Mississippi, but at the same time, she was very elitist. So she was very paternalistic towards the people in Mississippi. So that's one of the things that, maybe we don't want to, do it that way.
Right. And another question that I had that really interests me is the fact that these Black women set up clinics and started hospitals, and also worked for desegregation as well. Right. And I've always been interested in the impact of legal desegregation in the 50s and 60s on these organizations that were created to serve the Black community. Mm-hmm. So do you have any thoughts or comments on the impact of desegregation on healthcare access and availability to Black?
I have I'll tell a story about the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses that started, in the early 20th century. And around 1950, it voted to disband because they felt that the needs of Black people could be handled by the American Nurses Association. So they had a gala. I mean, they had a gala, fancy, hotel in New York, and people like, members of the Black community were saying, oh, this is what we should do for other organizations. So that's 1950. 1965, the Black Nurses Association is started. So 15 years later, it was, no, Black nurses need to have a place for themselves where they could advocate for the needs of Black people. Same thing happened, one of the things that happened and some of the earlier work I've done is looking at Black hospitals, how, Black hospitals declined. And closed, especially after some of the legal rulings about desegregation. And one of the things is that they thought that optimistically that desegregation was going to be a two-way street. That the Black hospitals, white people will go to the Black hospitals, Black people will go to the white hospitals. But no, it was like this stem away from Black hospitals, which raises questions about, quality of care, issues around trust, and also jobs. Hospitals provided jobs for people. So it had, had a ripple effect.
Indeed. Thank you. And we do have one more question from the audience. I know we're right at 12:30, but I hope we
It's
get
okay. It's okay.
All right. They say, thank you, Dr. Gamble. I recall you mentioning a patient feeling unworthy because she was treated by a Black woman physician.
Mhm.
Can you comment on how the perception of Black women physicians have changed or remained the same?
Well, I mean, I think it has changed. I think that when that happened with May Chen, you didn't hardly see any Black women physicians. But the other thing that I think that story illustrates, at least for me, is how Black people can take in some of the negative attitudes and racism of the wider society and how they view the world. You know, I think it has changed. But that, for May Chen, it was that, that there was this belief that if you want a good doctor, you don't go to a Black doctor. But I think that has changed in the Black community when we start seeing, the research on, racial concordance and physician and patient being the same race, and how people feel that a Black physician might have their interests more at heart than a white physician. So I do think it has changed.
Thank you. All right, well, that brings us to the end of today's session. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, some time with us. So I just want to say that the next speaker for Exploring Social Justice will be on Wednesday, October 21st at 11:30 a.m. It will be with Dr. Lily Wong, who is Associate Professor in the Departments of Literature and Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies at American University. She'll present a talk called Sex Work, Media Networks, and Trans-Pacific Histories of Effect, based on her new book, Trans-Pacific Attachments. And you may register for this program through the library events page. So thank you once again, Dr. Gamble. I will definitely be in touch with you further.
Okay, I hope so.
So everyone else, take care. Have a great rest of the afternoon, and we'll see you at the next one.
So you're going to contact me?